Today, millions of people live ordinary lives with diabetes. A daily injection, a steady routine, a normal life expectancy. It's so unremarkable that most of us never stop to think about it. But less than a century and a half ago, a diagnosis of diabetes, especially in a child, was one of the most terrifying words a doctor could say to a family. There was no treatment that actually worked. There was no hope of recovery. Doctors had only one thing to offer: send the child home and let the family say goodbye. This is one of the darkest and least discussed chapters in modern medicine. And by the end of this story, you'll understand how a group of desperate, underfunded researchers, working through a single hot Toronto summer with almost no money and no guarantee of success, found something that still saves millions of lives today. What makes this story remarkable isn't just the discovery itself, it's how close it came to never happening at all. How a chain of underfunded experiments, personal sacrifice, and sheer stubbornness against every reasonable expectation of failure produced one of the most consequential medical breakthroughs of the century, almost by accident. Diabetes is not a modern disease. Physicians in ancient Egypt described a condition marked by unusual thirst and frequent urination as far back as 1500 BCE. Centuries later, physicians in ancient Greece and India noticed something else deeply strange. The urine of these patients tasted sweet, sometimes even attracting ants and insects. This is, quite literally, where the name comes from. Diabetes mellitus translates roughly to sweet, siphoning through. For thousands of years, doctors could observe the disease, describe it in painstaking detail, and do almost nothing about it. Patients, especially children, who almost always had the most severe and fastest progressing form of the disease, would lose weight rapidly no matter how much they ate, grow weaker by the week, and eventually slip into a coma before dying, often within months of diagnosis. By the 1800s, physicians had come to understand a critical piece of the puzzle. Diabetes had something to do with the body's inability to process sugar properly. But understanding the problem and solving it were two very different things. Doctors across Europe and America tried an enormous range of remedies over the following decades. Opium, exercise regimens, oat-based diets, even prescribed doses of alcohol, believed at the time to somehow help regulate the body's response to sugar. None of it worked in any meaningful, lasting way. Patients would sometimes report feeling temporarily better, only for their condition to continue its steady decline, regardless of what treatment they tried. By the late 1800s, researchers had narrowed the mystery down considerably. Two German scientists, Oskar Minkowski and Joseph von Mering, made a critical discovery in 1889, almost by accident. After surgically removing the pancreas from a dog for an unrelated experiment, they noticed the animal began showing all the classic symptoms of severe diabetes almost immediately. This confirmed, for the first time, that something produced in the pancreas was essential for regulating blood sugar. The problem was, no one yet knew exactly what that substance was, or how to extract and use it safely. For the next 3 decades, that missing piece remained frustratingly out of reach. By the early 1900s, doctors had discovered exactly one method that seemed to extend a diabetic patient's life, even briefly: severely restricting their food intake. The most prominent advocate of this approach was an American physician named Dr. Frederick Allen. Allen's method involved placing patients, including young children, on extremely restrictive diets, sometimes to the point that patients were consuming barely enough to stay alive at all. The theory made a certain grim sense. If the body couldn't properly process sugar, the solution was to starve the disease by starving the patient. The results were exactly as brutal as they sound. Photographs of children under this treatment from the era are almost unbearable to look at today. Skeletal, hollow-eyed, aged well beyond their years by malnutrition. Some patients did survive slightly longer under this regimen, but slightly longer often meant trading a quicker death from diabetic complications for a slower one from starvation itself. Many families were left with an impossible choice: watch a child waste away from the disease, or watch them waste away from the treatment. It's worth being clear about something here. This wasn't medical negligence or cruelty. Physicians at the time were doing everything within their power, following the only method that had any measurable effect at all. There simply wasn't anything else. This was, quite literally, the best medicine had to offer. Some historians estimate that in the years just before insulin's discovery, a child diagnosed with severe diabetes had, on average, only about 1 year left to live, regardless of how carefully their diet was managed. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, this treatment was disproportionately hardest on children, who needed calories and nutrients simply to grow, let alone survive a serious illness. Some physicians of the era wrote candidly in their case notes about the impossible position they were in, extending a child's life by weeks or months, while watching that same child grow weaker, more listless, and increasingly detached from the normal experience of childhood entirely. Hospital wards dedicated to these patients became known, quietly and grimly, among staff as some of the most difficult places to work in the entire hospital. Now, let's move to the summer of 1921 in Toronto, Canada, because this is where everything changes. A young surgeon named Frederick Banting had a theory. He believed that a substance produced somewhere in the pancreas, an organ scientists already suspected was connected to diabetes, might be the missing piece. If that substance could be extracted and injected into a diabetic patient, Banting believed it might regulate their blood sugar in a way nothing else could. The problem was, Banting had almost no resources to test this idea. He wasn't an established researcher. He had no laboratory of his own, no research funding to speak of, and, frankly, no real expertise in the biochemistry his theory depended on. What he did have was persistence, and eventually, a University of Toronto physiology professor named J.J.R. McLeod agreed, reluctantly and mostly to get Banting to stop asking, to lend him a small, poorly equipped lab space for the summer, along with a research assistant, a young student named Charles Best. What followed was months of grueling, often gruesome experimental work. Banting and Best spent that entire summer surgically operating on dogs, attempting to extract the substance they were looking for from the pancreas, then testing crude extracts on other diabetic dogs to see if blood sugar levels would respond. The lab had no air conditioning in the middle of a Toronto summer. Funding was so tight that Banting reportedly sold some of his own possessions to keep the experiments running. Many of the early extracts were too impure to use, causing severe reactions in the test animals rather than any benefit. Failure piled on top of failure for months, but slowly, extract by extract, the results began to shift. Blood sugar levels in some of the treated dogs began dropping in exactly the way Banting's theory predicted. There's a detail from that summer that historians often return to. At one particularly low point, funding had run so dry that Banting and Best were reportedly paying certain lab expenses directly out of their own pockets, uncertain whether the university would even continue supporting the project through the fall. Best would later describe the summer not as a triumphant scientific breakthrough in progress, but as a grinding, exhausting slog with no clear end in sight, the two of them working late into the night in a stiflingly hot lab, uncertain if they were on the verge of something extraordinary or simply chasing a dead end like so many researchers before them. By late summer and into the fall of 1921, something had clearly changed. The extracts were becoming more consistent, the results more reproducible. McLeod, who had largely kept his distance from the day-to-day experiments over the summer, returned from his own break to find the results compelling enough to bring in additional resources, including, critically, the biochemist James Collip, whose expertise in purification would prove essential to the discovery's next, most dangerous phase, testing it on an actual human being. By January 1922, the team, now joined by a skilled biochemist named James Collip, who helped purify the extract into something safer for human use, believed they were ready to attempt something no one had ever tried before, testing the extract on an actual human diabetic patient. The first patient was a 14-year-old boy named Leonard Thompson, who was being treated at Toronto General Hospital. Leonard was, by every account, dying. He weighed a little over 60 pounds, drifting in and out of a diabetic coma, and had essentially run out of time under Dr. Allen's starvation method. His family had nothing left to lose. The very first injection, given on January 11, 1922, was disappointing. The extract wasn't purified enough, and it caused an allergic reaction without any meaningful improvement in Leonard's condition. For a moment, it looked like this breakthrough, too, might simply be another failure in a long line of them. But 12 days later, on January 23rd, a second, more refined batch of the extract, thanks to Collip's purification work, was administered. This time, the results were almost immediate. Leonard's dangerously high blood sugar levels dropped dramatically within hours. Over the following days, his strength slowly began to return. A boy who had been given essentially no chance of survival was, for the first time, showing genuine signs of recovery. Word of what had happened at Toronto General spread through the medical community with incredible speed. Other dying diabetic patients at the hospital, many of them children on the brink of death from Dr. Allen's starvation regimen, were given the new extract in the following weeks. Patients who had been skeletal and unconscious were, within days, sitting up, asking for food, and, in several remarkable cases, recovering enough to leave the hospital entirely. Doctors and nurses who witnessed this firsthand later described it in almost spiritual terms. Patients who had been prepared for death were, quite literally, coming back to life in front of them. One frequently cited account from Toronto General describes a hospital ward filled with children in diabetic comas, many of them not expected to survive the week. As insulin injections were administered across the ward, one after another, children began waking up. Some accounts described parents weeping in hallways, doctors moving from bed to bed in stunned disbelief, entire families who had already begun preparing for a funeral instead preparing to bring their child home. Whether every detail of these accounts has been preserved with perfect historical accuracy is debated among historians, but the core outcome is not in question. An entire ward of terminal patients experienced, within days, one of the most dramatic mass recoveries in the history of medicine. Word of the discovery, which the team eventually named insulin, after the Latin word for the island-shaped cells in the pancreas where it's produced, spread globally within months. Requests for the treatment poured in from desperate families and physicians around the world faster than the small Toronto lab could possibly produce it. Recognizing that they couldn't scale production fast enough on their own, the University of Toronto struck an agreement with the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly to begin mass-producing insulin. Within roughly a year of Leonard Thompson's first successful injection, insulin was being distributed to hospitals across North America and Europe. Thousands of patients who had been living under a certain death sentence were suddenly given a treatment that let them live essentially normal lives. The impact is difficult to overstate. Before insulin, a diagnosis of severe childhood diabetes was, in effect, a terminal illness. Within just a few years of its discovery, it had become a manageable chronic condition, one of the fastest transformations of a fatal diagnosis into a survivable one in the entire history of medicine. In 1923, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded for the discovery, but only to Banting and MacLeod, the two men whose names had been formally attached to the research. This decision sparked immediate controversy. Banting himself was reportedly furious that Best, his hands-on research partner throughout that grueling summer, had been excluded from the prize entirely. In protest, Banting publicly announced he would share his own prize money with Best. MacLeod, in turn, shared his portion with Collip, whose purification breakthrough had been essential to the treatment actually working on humans. To this day, medical historians still debate whether the Nobel Committee got the credit right. The scale of what happened next is worth pausing on. Within about 2 years of that first successful injection, insulin production had scaled from a handful of hand-prepared batches in a university lab to an industrial pharmaceutical operation supplying hospitals across 2 continents. Life insurance data from the period shows a measurable shift in mortality statistics for diagnosed diabetics almost immediately after wide distribution began. A shift so sharp that some public health researchers of the era described it as one of the fastest measurable impacts of any medical discovery they had ever documented. It's also worth noting what the researchers chose not to do. Banting, Best, Collip, and MacLeod could have patented insulin and controlled its production for enormous personal profit. Instead, they sold the patent to the University of Toronto for a symbolic sum, reportedly $1, specifically so that the treatment could be manufactured widely and affordably rather than restricted by a single company's pricing. Whatever debates remain about how credit for the discovery was divided, this decision is generally regarded by medical historians as a genuinely selfless one, made at a moment when the researchers could easily have chosen otherwise. It's worth sitting with the timeline for a moment. For thousands of years, diabetes was a slow, well-documented death sentence that medicine could describe in perfect detail, but do almost nothing to stop. Then, within a single desperate summer in a poorly funded Toronto lab, that changed permanently. Today, the injection that once represented an almost miraculous last-resort intervention for a dying child is something millions of people administer to themselves quietly, routinely, without a second thought, at home, at work, without any sense that they're using one of the most significant medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. Perhaps the next time you see someone check their blood sugar or give themselves an injection, it's worth remembering there was a time, not so long ago, when families were told there was nothing left to do but say goodbye, and that a handful of exhausted researchers working through a single hot summer refused to accept that as the final answer. It's also worth remembering how fragile that outcome really was. A slightly less stubborn researcher, a slightly less patient professor, a lab that ran out of funding a few weeks earlier than it did. Any one of these could have ended the story before it ever reached Leonard Thompson's hospital bed. Sometimes the line between one of history's great medical triumphs and one more forgotten failed experiment is thinner than we'd like to admit.